and welcome to Discussion Today. I am Tina Jha. India on Friday strongly pitched for easing cuts in crude oil production, saying high oil prices are hurting the consumption-led recovery of several countries, which include India. Spokesperson in the Ministry of External Affairs, Arindam Bagchi, said that India has been appealing to crude oil-producing countries, OPEC and OPEC Plus, since the beginning of the year to ease crude oil production cuts that were announced last year. Also noting that OPEC and OPEC Plus have announced a slight easing of crude production cuts, the MEA spokesperson said it is still far below the originally announced schedule of cuts. The OPEC, that is the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, is an influential entity that plays a key role in policy formulations relating to crude production, while the OPEC Plus comprises the OPEC countries, Russia and several other crude producers. The OPEC oil cartel and allied countries had announced last week that they would gradually add back some 2 million barrels per day of oil production starting May to July, moving cautiously in pace with the recovery of the global economy from the COVID-19 pandemic. So the group will add back 350,000 barrels per day in May, 350,000 in June, and about 4 lakh in the month of July. On Discussion Today, we will talk about how the OPEC cartel and its allies' decision to cautiously increase oil output is hurting several countries, including India. Besides, we'll also talk about how ready is India to look beyond OPEC to meet its crude needs. Joining me on the program today are two special guests. Let me introduce them to you. I'm joined on the program by Mr. Saurabh Chandra, former Secretary, Ministry of Petroleum, and Deepshikha Sikarwar, she's Senior Editor at The Economic Times. Thank you to both my guests for joining me on Discussion Today. Mr. Chandra, let me begin the program today with you. So to simplify it for our viewers and also for us, help us understand how is the decision by the OPEC and the OPEC Plus to not ease cuts in crude oil production impacting India, leaving us to repeatedly urge them to do so since the beginning of this year?
You see, India has been hurt by high prices because of the demand-supply imbalance. And that is the reason why OPEC Plus is going in for these cuts. OPEC by itself was not so influential in determining prices, but when they got Russia into it, then their power increased, and therefore they are in a position to influence prices. Crude oil has a global price. I mean, there are variations between Brent, Western Texas Intermediate, Bonnie Light, etc. But the fact remains that the benchmark would be around Brent. And in Indian basket depends on the Dubai crude, the Omani crude, and of course, Brent. And therefore, we are hit by these high prices. And one thing I must make clear is that every country takes decisions in its own interest. It listens to some other country only if it helps to further its own strategic interest. And therefore, the extent to which OPEC Plus would listen to India would be very limited. And they would take advantage of India's vulnerability because of its high import dependence. And the starting point should perhaps be reducing India's import dependency. Prime Minister recognized this in Urja Sangam way back almost 6 years ago. He asked for reducing the import dependence by 10%. Unfortunately, the import dependence has gone up, and therefore we have to start within our own geographical boundaries. We have to find more crude oil here. We have to produce more crude oil here so that our dependence on imported oil gets reduced. That's
Absolutely.
part one of it. Part two of it is to diversify your sources from which you import crude oil. And part three of it is that what kind of contracts do you enter into? At the moment, almost 2/3 to 70% of your crude oil is in long-term contracts on terms which are not necessarily in our favor. Spot purchases are maybe 30%. This percentage of spot purchases should go up so that we can take advantage of localized and otherwise fallen prices.
Okay. So all of these aspects we'll discuss in greater detail in due course of the program. Mr. Chandra, I'll come back to you. Let me bring in Deepshikha Sikrwar. So despite India being the largest buyer of crude oil from the OPEC Plus grouping, and since the beginning of this year, we've made repeated appeals, it hasn't borne as much of an impact as it should be. What, according to you, are the factors behind the OPEC Plus sticking to its decision to not increase oil output is the first question. And the second, how much is our dependency on the OPEC Plus countries that are we ready to explore the other options, as Mr. Chandra has pointed out?
Tina, thank you. First of all, we have to understand, and like Mr. Chandra mentioned, every country takes a decision in accordance with its own economy, in accordance with what is best for it. So while India has continuously made appeal to the OPEC and OPEC Plus, but the pricing is something they will work out, or they will move on it only if it suits them, if it is in their interest. So while they have taken a decision to, bring down, the cuts to increase some supplies, but that is not enough to really impact the global crude prices.
Yes.
That is one thing. Now, the second question which you asked is whether India is diversifying. Now, India is the third largest importer, as we know, and a large part, a substantial part of our import comes from Middle East, very large part from Saudi. So obviously, our pricing, our supplies are getting impacted. Now, over the last few years, we have tried to diversify our basket, but that is very limited. And like Mr. Chandra said, in terms of the strategy, you have to have both your long-term supplies in place and also your spots, which will enable you to sort of move around, provide you some flexibility on the supplies and pricing.
Okay, Mr. Chandra, so if we are planning and if we have started actually working to look beyond the OPEC Plus for our crude oil requirement, what have been the recent efforts towards achieving this, towards exploring some other options to reduce our dependency on the OPEC Plus countries?
Crude oil imports from the US have increased. Now, there is a shale band. What happens in the shale band is that once the price crosses $60, $65 per barrel, shale oil production goes up. Otherwise, it's shut down. Now, the surplus is actually coming from the shale oil production. So, USA is one advantage. The other source could be Iran. That would depend on how the US-Iran ties turn out under the new regime of President Biden. Now, Iran was one of our major sources of crude oil imports. They gave us very favorable terms. Now, should we start looking at Iran to source some of the crude oil? That is the question. Now, it's once again a strategic decision. It is once again a diplomatic decision. And as we all know that a lot of economics is influenced by politics. So it's finally mixed up with the geopolitics. And you would invariably find geoeconomics and geopolitics linked up. So that is where we'll have to look for it. Because other than the OPEC Plus, you could perhaps import it from some countries on the west coast of Africa or South America, which are not so influenced by these decisions. But then once again, the South American countries themselves are in a fair amount of trouble. Venezuela production, Brazil production. Therefore, one should try, one will be able to diversify to some extent, but OPEC Plus knows that the sources are not too many other than theirs from which you can import crude oil.
Okay. Deepshika ji, when we talk about diversification of crude resources, and that of course is being pitched as another option, as an alternative. We've heard the oil minister also talking about this particular measure. He's urged refiners to speed up diversification of the crude resources. This of course could be one of the options, but are we, in terms of infrastructure, how prepared are we going forward? What could be the challenges? Will these refineries, are they equipped enough to go ahead with this?
See, if you look at in terms of strategy, past 3-4 years, we've been consciously trying to diversify our import basket because we were to a large extent dependent on Iran crude, and we had to move away from it. So we have tried to sort of bring in other suppliers, and refineries have also upgraded their infrastructure and their refining capacity in line with that diversification. But lately, that diversification has not really worked for India because most of our contracts have been long-term contracts. So government will have to really look at how to balance, how to really proportion these long-term contracts and spot supplies, and the refining capacity, the infrastructure upgrade within the country to deal with different mixes. So that will go. But once a policy decision is taken, and one thing which we need to understand, Tina, is like Mr. Chandra also mentioned, it's all geopolitics. So geopolitics and the political economy of it. So it is a very dynamic situation for India to take a very quick call. While we are working towards diversification and we have been working towards diversification, it is not something that can happen overnight. It will take considerable amount of investment and infrastructure upgrade, which I'm sure the government is working on.
Okay. Mr. Chandra, so a lot of other experts have also said that diversification, easier said than done. It could be a tall order because around 79.4% of the world's proven oil reserves are located in the OPEC Plus countries. So this, of course, going forward could be a huge challenge. And for that, we need to be very, very equipped.
Yes, diversification would be a challenge. But nevertheless, we have to put in our best efforts into it because we don't have too many choices. Otherwise, we would always be vulnerable to, for example, the Asian premium that Saudi Arabia is said to be charging. We've been paying $1.50 more than what they charge the Western countries. Therefore, you have to reduce your dependence to any particular source. Iraq is the country from which we import the maximum quantity of crude oil. USA imports have been picking up. Now, let us see where we go from here, because OPEC Plus is a very powerful cartel. You see, a cartel needs to have three things. One, it needs to have a dominant position. Two, there has to be discipline within the cartel. And the third is that they should have the ability to set prices. There has to be entry barriers. Now, this is what has happened with OPEC Plus. The cartelization has increased.
So when we talk about reducing dependence on oil, Deepshika ji, a lot of other options on reducing dependence on West Asia we've discussed. But what are the other alternate sources of energy that we could further work upon within our territory so that our dependence on imports comes down drastically?
See, as part of government's long-term strategy on bringing down India's import bill and actually cutting down India's import dependence on other nations, because obviously we are not a producer, we are a consumer, and a large part of our consumption is imported. So we would always be vulnerable to supply shocks, both in terms of volumes and in terms of values. So if you have seen over the past few years, there is a conscious effort from the government side to move to electrical vehicles, to move to battery operated vehicles. But that transition will take time. We need to understand that these changes will not happen overnight. There is a push from the government, definitely. Government is providing stops. There is going to be much more, the renewal of oil-based cars and all those things. Those are happening. We are looking at more fuel-efficient cars. So these things will help cut down India's import bill to an extent, but our consumption, is increasing over time. Although during the pandemic it had come down, but it is now picking up as recovery sort of gains pace. So there is an effort from the government side in terms of the policy, but for that policy and for new technologies to actually come about and be available to consumers at prices that they can afford is going to take some time.
So, Mr. Chandra, quite a couple of challenges if you're talking about transition to other sources of energy, and of course, in terms of readiness of also the consumers to adapt to some other source will be difficult. So, what going forward should be the approach of the government so that the import, of course, continues, but at the same time, we have to reduce our dependency and ensure that we are not always treated as vulnerable as we always will be, being the largest consumers?
You see, transportation is critically dependent on the internal combustion engine. Now, the alternative is electric mobility. The challenge in electric mobility is the battery. Now, battery costs at the moment are high, so there's a differential in what a car would cost, which has an internal combustion engine, and which is battery operated when you buy it on the road. Now, till the battery costs come down, this differential would remain. A lot of money is being put into R&D in battery technology. That is one part of it, and India should make huge efforts to look at alternative materials to be used in the batteries. Why I'm saying this is because the batteries which are being manufactured today, most of them are coming from China. Now, the import dependence of batteries manufactured in China is far more than what it is when it comes to crude oil from a particular country. So, battery manufacturing has to move on. We don't have the raw materials to manufacture batteries as they are being done today. If we get alternative materials which are available in this country, yes, then we can move on. So battery technology is the challenge, and we must put our entire academia and industry into this to make sure that we become a battery manufacturing hub. That will take time. It's not coming in a hurry. And therefore, for a couple of years at least, maybe the next decade, we will continue to remain dependent on crude oil imports.
Absolutely. And all of these challenges will remain until we remain one of the largest consumers of crude oil. When we talk about India becoming a battery manufacturer, Deepshikha ji, what are the ways in which we have to strengthen ourselves? Because a lot of raw material is coming in from China, as Mr. Chandra has mentioned. What are the other avenues, which are the other partners that we could approach for procuring these raw materials and strengthening our battery operations as far as manufacturing them is concerned?
So when we are talking about battery, if you recall that NITI Aayog is working on a policy to get battery manufacturing in the country, to get investment into that space. And also, this whole entire plan which it is working on will also entail, research and development within the country. Government is also working on, providing production-linked incentives to battery manufacturers, which would sort of work within a, time frame to ensure that the production increases. Where suppliers are concerned, there is China's dominance. There is no doubt about it. But which is what we are trying to curtail going forward. We are talking to manufacturers in Japan and Korea as well to ensure that diversity is maintained within the supply. They're not dependent on one country. But the big plan is to get manufacturers right in the country and get them to make it here.
Absolutely. So not just reducing import of oil, but also looking at a sustainable energy future for which we'll have to leverage all energy sources that are available to us. So with that, I'll have to call it a wrap on this edition of discussion today. Thank you once again to both my guests for joining me on the program and sharing your thoughts with us on the subject. Pleasure having you on the show with us. So that's it from us on discussion today. Just in case you missed the television broadcast, let me remind my viewers that you can also watch it on YouTube and Twitter, and you can also get back to us with your feedback and suggestions. Thank you for your time.